What's up, audio geeks? Welcome back to the studio. In today's video, we're going to be going over some more Pro Tools basics that you need to know if you're working with Pro Tools at home. So in today's video, we're going to go over the IO Dialog and how to set it up for whatever hardware that you have. There really isn't any secret on this dialog. It's really easy. It really just depends on whatever hardware that you're using. So it's good to know what your hardware can and can't do. That way, it should be really straightforward to set up your IO properly for Pro Tools. Okay, with Pro Tools open, you have to go over to the Setup tab and drop down to IO. Once you click that, you'll get this dialog over here. The IO Setup dialog has many different tabs. Each takes care of one task of your hardware and the internal settings in Pro Tools. So let's go over the basic dialog and see what everything does. With the Input tab open, this tab essentially takes care of the inputs to our hardware and maps them to a specific input in Pro Tools. So you'll have a list with everything that you have. In my case, since I'm just using this MacBook Air, I only have MacBook Air microphone, and that's a mono input. This is something that will definitely change if you're using a different setup. But let's say I had something different. You can go to New Path and create the path depending on what you need. So what are the settings in the new path dialog? Well, it's really straightforward. You essentially get the same thing as if you were creating a new track inside a session. You can create one new and then the width of the track, and then you can name it, and then you can add more tracks. It's really straightforward, and once you hit that, you'll get all these different input options. I would suggest naming them to whatever hardware you're using. Let's say you have an 8-channel interface that's hooked up to maybe any preamps that you have. You can name that input according to the preamp that you have. That way, it's really easy to find what you're actually using. In my case, since I'm just using this laptop, there isn't much flexibility to be had here. But in our larger setup where we have an analog mixer, we essentially map it to whatever input that we're using in our analog mixer. What else can be found in this dialog? Well, you have the default format, which should usually be set to stereo, unless you're working with surround stuff, which if you're recording yourself at home, is not something that you have to worry about. And the same goes for path order. This only matters for surround setups and if you're using anything that's larger than stereo. Embed 11 settings from essentially only is active if you own an 11 rack. If that's the case, you can use whatever setting you have on your 11 and that will get embedded to the audio clip that you're using. Next, let's explore the output dialog. As you can see, this is really similar to the input dialog. The main difference is that we're now dealing with the outputs to our hardware and not the inputs. Everything else is mostly the same. The only big difference here is that you can pick your monitor path, your audition path, beat object fold down path. This is only used for surround stuff. Output meter path. This is only used for the small meter that you get on the top bar on Pro Tools. You will probably not need this. And AFL, PFL path. This stands for after fader listen or pre-fader listen. And that's essentially if you're auditioning a send or something else and you're just trying to use Pro Tools to take care of all your monitoring. For the most part, if you're just recording yourself at home, you don't have to worry about these settings. I would just use whatever works for you. Next, we have the bus tab. The bus tab is really important because this is what actually maps your hardware path to your internal paths in Pro Tools. So whatever you create here is what is going to be really important. So let's say I have an 8-channel interface. Unless I map the hardware to internal buses in Pro Tools, you won't be able to use it fully. So the way to set it up properly is just to select everything using Command A or Control A if you're on PC, and then you can hit default. And make sure that you're using the all buses setting. And then you can just hit default and that will create everything that you will need to set up your basic routing. Usually what you'll get is from bus 1 all the way to bus 24 in stereo pairs. So you essentially get 12 stereo pairs of buses. If you need more than that, you can just go to new path and create as many buses as you need. Also, in the later versions of Pro Tools, if you're using Pro Tools Ultimate, for instance, Pro Tools will automatically create new buses if you need them. So you don't have to worry too much about the bus dialog unless you pick up a session from somebody else and it's not mapping your outputs properly. Then you can open up the IO dialog, select everything using Command A and hit default, and that will always fix it. The next tab we have is the Insert tab. Insert tab is used in case you want to integrate analog hardware with your Pro Tools rig. The way to do that is to hook up your hardware to your converters, and then whatever input and output pair that you're using, say you're hooking up an Avalon 737, you will hook it up to maybe channel 4 on your AD. You will have to use the input 4 and output 4, and that will essentially transform your Avalon 737 into a Pro Tools plugin. And then you can pull it up whenever you insert something into a track, and you don't have to route it inside your session. Pro Tools will take care of that automatically if you set this up on the IO Setup dialog. And the way to create new paths is the same as any other track. Finally, the mic preamps tab is only used if you're using any Avid hardware that has mic preamps built in, or if you're using an external mic preamp from Avid. I don't think that will be the case for most of you, but if that would be the case, this is where you would find it. And finally, the hardware insert delay is essentially where you can tweak the delay compensation in Pro Tools if you're using any analog hardware with your Pro Tools rig. For the most part, you don't have to touch this unless you're facing any kind of real issue. So this might be a little tricky. You will actually have to go and do the math to figure out how many milliseconds of delay that you actually have, and then you can compensate it here. But for the most part, you won't have to touch this unless you really have an issue. Finally, the last thing that we haven't covered is the export settings dialog, where you can export everything that you have saved here and just have it as a preset, and the import settings dialog, where you can import any of the settings and save it to either one tab or all tabs by just clicking the apply to all tabs button. Once you're done, you can hit OK, and now that essentially takes care of all your IO settings. It's really straightforward, and it really depends on whatever hardware that you have. In the next few videos that we're doing, we're going to be covering other important settings like the hardware dialog and the playback engine dialog, as well as the preferences dialog. For now, this is all for this video. I'll see you guys on the next one.